And that would be my cue to come back and say thanks for coming back after the break. Welcome back. And we're going to move into our panel this afternoon, Interdependence and Crisis. I'm going to do a very quick intro of our speakers, and then I'm going to turn it right over. Elaine Westbrooks is the University Librarian and Vice Provost of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's a member of our Board of Governors, and I thank her for moderating this panel this afternoon. And I also want to say thanks to Kathleen Fitzpatrick, who is Director of Digital Humanities and Professor of English at Michigan State, who's joining us. My old friend Lisa Hinchliffe, Professor and Coordinator of Information Literacy Services at University of Illinois, and my friend and former direct colleague Patricia Sway, who is Program Officer at Public Knowledge at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. I will now get out of the way and let you all talk.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Mike. It is really an honor to moderate this panel of wonderful, amazing women. And I just want to welcome all of you for joining us for our first virtual HathiTrust member meeting. And just to, I guess, summarize some of the things we've heard all morning or all afternoon, is that we're going through two pandemics, one of racial inequity and another of COVID. And that has made us all vulnerable, socially, personally, but professionally. And so when I think of interdependence, I think of this mutual reliance, I think of reciprocity, and I also think of support. And so our great set of panelists today is going to walk us through how they are thinking about this interdependence in the worlds that they live in. And so the first question that I would like to pose to our panel is just to lay the groundwork and provide some context about the area you sit with right now. And what are the questions that are most relevant to you as you think about interdependence? So Kathleen, I'll ask you to go first.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to get to be here and to talk a little bit from the scholarly perspective about this question of interdependence and how we're thinking about the moment of crisis that we're in right now. I mean, this moment of crisis in higher education is part of a long ongoing series of crises that have just mounted over time. COVID-19 and its budgetary fallout are only the most recent among them. And the causes of these crises that we're surrounded by are complex, but a whole lot of them, I think, can be traced back to a single key shift in American thinking, where once as a nation we professed and at least in some ways acted upon the idea that higher education was and should be a public good, serving broadly social ends and deserving of broad social support. We've increasingly since the 1980s been drawn to understand higher education instead as a private responsibility, right? Serving individual goals and relying increasingly on private funding. And the implications of this shift are far-reaching, but they land us in the precarious situation in which we find ourselves today, in which financial considerations can lead our institutions to make decisions that are not in alignment with their missions, and in which public support for those missions continues to deteriorate. So the question is how we get out of this mess. And I wish I were capable of laying out a solution for you in 5 minutes. Alas, I am not, but what I can tell you is this. I mean, one key, and I think perhaps even the key to reclaiming public support and not incidentally public funding for public higher education lies in re-engaging the public directly in our mission and in all of the work that we do on campus. And my recent book, Generous Thinking, explores a number of different means through which we might reach that goal. But I want today to focus just briefly on one in particular, and that has to do with the development of platforms that enable scholars to do their work in public. I mean, after all, the public can't be induced to care about or support the work that we do if nobody can see it. So the open access movement, and it's not incidental, of course, that this is Open Access Week, has long argued that knowledge production will benefit from making the products of publicly funded research publicly available. I mean, that is, making work more accessible, helps it achieve greater impact, and it allows the work to be more readily built upon. And open access publishing has direct benefits for institutions, as we've all seen, helping them undo some of the budgetary damage that's been caused by extortionate journal subscriptions. But true openness requires us not just to make the consumption of the products of research more equitable, but rather to make participation in the production of knowledge more equitable, even as we continue to uphold and advance the forms of peer review that are, of course, the hallmark of scholarly work. And these goals finally ask us to think beyond access. And we need instead to be thinking broadly about how and where scholarly work gets done. We need to take a careful look at the platforms that we use for research today, especially at a moment like this when we find ourselves utterly dependent on these platforms like Zoom for reaching our colleagues, for reaching our students, for reaching our communities. We need to consider the degree of control we have over those platforms, especially as we rely on them more and more, and the extent to which the development of those platforms and the terms under which we use them are in keeping with our deepest values. And this is especially true of the platforms that control not only our publications, but all of the data that we produce on campus. I mean, after all, if social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter have taught us nothing else in recent years, they've without question proven that giving away our data will cost us in the end. Or as a friend of mine is fond of saying, if you're not at the table, you're the meal. Right? Unless the academy has a voice in the governance of the platforms on which academic work relies today, we're going to be at the mercy of those who do. So alternatives. My colleagues and I have spent the last several years developing Humanities Commons, which is an open source, open access, academy-owned and governed platform designed to support the work of scholars and their organizations and institutions. Humanities Commons is a network on which any interested user can create an account free of charge and use it to develop a public profile, to participate in group discussions and collaborations, and to use the open access repository to share their work with the world. We have more than 24,000 registered users working in fields across the humanities and in countries around the world who are making their work public and who are inviting discussion and participation in new kinds of research. So the platform was originally developed by the Modern Language Association, and we're in the process of moving it to MSU, as well as launching the first pilot of an institutional node on the Commons network. So MSU Commons, which is in open beta right now, is open to all MSU faculty, staff, and students. And we're hoping that this pilot will enable us to build an expanded knowledge network across the campus with a transformative potential to facilitate, disseminate, and preserve new work that's being produced by public and connected scholars all around the world. And because the most important aspect of this network is that it's hosted at a university for universities on an academy-owned platform that's governed by and accountable to the academic organizations and institutions that contribute to its maintenance. We're really focused on the ways that those organizations and institutions become not just interdependent, but intersupportive in working together on a platform like this. We've received, we're grateful to say, significant support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and from the National Endowment for the Humanities in building out this platform. And we're really at a moment with its development at which we're recognizing that the heart of sustainability, not just for Humanities Commons, but for higher education today, and one potential step along the path out of the crises that we're in, is to think in this interdependent way, to bring these organizations and institutions together to mutually support a platform that we can all use to hold the assets that are being produced on our campuses in trust for the public that we all collectively serve. So I will stop there. Thanks a lot again for having me today.
Thank you. Lisa, I'm wondering if you could go next. And of course, thinking about, you've been an academic research librarian for a while, and how do you approach interdependence from the role that you have and the role you have had as a leader over the past few years?
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you to Mike and all of his colleagues for their really generous setup here today and the opportunity to be on this panel and to be in conversation with these other people that I admire so much, but also I look forward to the questions that will come from the larger membership meeting attendees as well. It's interesting. I think one of the things that I can say about my own career is I've been really fortunate in that I work at a fabulous library. Hi, John. With really amazing colleagues, and we do fantastic cutting edge work in many, many different areas. So I've gotten to do that as a librarian. But because we are also faculty at Illinois, I've had this great opportunity to sort of sit on the scholar side as well and think about, as somebody who is an active researcher publishing, and then because we have such a wonderful iSchool, the students and faculty there that we're able to collaborate with. So in many ways, my own career is itself an example of sort of sitting in those interdependencies in a given institution and what becomes possible when you are in that kind of environment, right? Where you have the students to work with, you have your great colleagues, you have amazing collections, a historical legacy that cannot be, you can't manufacture that overnight. We have to thank 120 years of investment from the state of Illinois into what we're able to do. But I think that, we're also talking about this in a time of pandemic, right? And I really appreciated you sort of raising for us that we are experiencing right now this obvious sort of most overarching pandemic, right? Of where we're all sitting at our dining rooms or living rooms or what have you, and joining together. And there's some real upsides of that, right? As Mike was talking about, the ways we can open up, we can involve others. And yet we also see, like was in the chat where Emily Dravinsky was like, I would come up and say hi to you, right? Like we're missing some of those things. But the pandemic itself has also been a moment in which we have become aware of other pandemics or epidemics that are really affecting us. And some of what Kathleen just pointed out, which has to do with investment in public goods and common goods, but also then those issues around racial inequities, discrimination. And one of the things that I think the pandemic has done, which will ultimately be a benefit, but it has revealed to us where there are fissures, cracks, and downright hostilities and gaps in especially areas where we might have thought we were actually doing okay. And this is not to say that everyone thought we were doing okay, because I think the other thing that I have really come to appreciate is the degree to which my own position in the world has shielded me from seeing some of the inequities that I was, fundamentally blind and unaware of in ways that I now regret quite a bit. And what that means then to say, okay, I have new knowledge. I guess I'll quote, we all love to quote Maya Angelou, but I think right now it's appropriate, right? Once you know better, you do better. So that's the call then for us now. So we've been stripped back. We've seen some new things. And so one of the things that I've seen is we, in this time, because we're contracting, is a time where through the decisions we make, we are revealing what we believe is core. Because we're stripping away, we're defunding those things that we don't see as core. One of the things that concerns me is some of the things being stripped away in certain cases are things that maybe are things like Kathleen was talking about or other people might want to talk about. HathiTrust has been an example of an organization that found a niche that honestly I think prevented it from being stripped away in many, many cases. Some other organizations are not going to fare as well. And some of those that are not going to fare as well are going to be ones that we will regret that they turned out not to be core. So I think there's going to be a real opportunity, therefore, in our thinking about our interdependence is to be very intentional. And this kind of even goes to what Jennifer Vinopol was calling to us of what do we want to have be core to our work? And then to think about what does it take to work together to make that core to our collective work. So I know we have additional questions that are going to that. So I think I'll pause there, and I definitely want to hear from Patricia, of course, as well.
Yeah, I mean, I will just insert that my understanding is the Mellon Foundation increased its commitment, and I believe it was from 300,000 to 500,000, which is amazing. But I just wanted to pose to you, Patricia, from your angle as a philanthropic support and a funder, what does interdependence look like to you?
Thank you, Elaine. Thanks for facilitating this panel, and thank you to Mike for inviting us to be here today. Well, as usual, I'm blown away by what Kathleen and Lisa have said and how Elaine has introduced the panel. And I don't want to take a whole lot of time telling about what I do, but I will say that interdependence is actually a program strategy for public knowledge. And what we are intent on doing is creating and strengthening networks for interdependent sharing of resources, services, and programs in the libraries and archives and publishing fields. I'll add that these aims are largely focused on materials from and about historically underrepresented cultures and populations, especially given the Foundation's recent announcement about our commitment to a social justice orientation to our grant making. So that's going to be very key as we go forward in building and strengthening interdependent relationships. And by calling out public in our name, as opposed to what we were before, which was a scholarly communications program, we're also signaling a desire and an ambition to go beyond the realm of scholarship and academic research and helping to build a culturally diverse, informed, and civically engaged society. So our strategy for interdependence is still, being cultivated. It's still growing, but I would say that we want to see more collaborations and partnerships that create opportunities for a range of institutions to receive Mellon support. We're interested in efforts that are interdependent networked because they can scale up the service or resources or programs that are being offered. And also we understand the collaborations and partnerships that are interdependent can help an effort become sustainable. And I've actually had some specific questions regarding interdependence that, I think our program and our foundation are interested in addressing over the next few years. So what does interdependence among institutions require in order for the shared or networked approach to thrive? Do we really know what the ingredients for that are? What current examples are there that could stand as models of success? And by the same token, what is missing increasingly in this relationship infrastructure, whether it supports a service, a program, or a technology? Also, institutions tend to join with like institutions, right, in a network collaboration. But when is it appropriate for an institution or for institutions that have sharply different, let's say, economic resources to be interdependent with less economically resourced institutions? Is that even possible? And I'm so glad Kathleen and Lisa have mentioned public good, because this is what is also on my mind. What does it take for libraries and archives-based interdependent efforts to be a public good? I don't know that we've figured that out entirely. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. I feel like I could just riff off of all of these responses, but I actually prepared some questions for today. And so, Lisa, I'm hoping you can kick off a response to the next question I have, which is really about the opportunities as well as the threats. You already mentioned that the pandemic has really exposed our weaknesses, our weak spots. But I want you to talk a little bit more because, of course, we're trying to get to the other side of this pandemic and nothing's going to be the same, right? Our users have different expectations. We have different expectations. We're rethinking so many different things. So what are those opportunities and threats that you think about that we're dealing with now and then think about 18 months from now?
Yeah, one of the things, that for a long time there was a rhetoric of when we get back to normal, and I've sort of always resisted that rhetoric of that there's any going back, right? There's time moves essentially in one direction, if you will. not that we don't bring forward certain things with us, but we don't go backwards. And so we are forever changed by our experiences of the past 7 months. Not unlike we were forever changed by the experience of the prior ones. It's just we were typically not as aware of it. And so we are in a moment of amazing opportunity in that we have a heightened level of awareness about what we are doing and the impact of the choices that we're making. And we feel the gravity too of the realities that for many of our institutions, we are going to see declining revenues, declining funds directed towards the library, in part because not only are institutions potentially receiving less revenue, even institutions that have either the same or growing revenues have an immense cost that they have borne in the last 7 months and going forward around the cost of operating in a pandemic. I was fortunate, we had our faculty meeting with the provost of our own institution just last week, and they're very forthright about some of the costs that have been borne. And if you know my institution, the University of Illinois, we're conducting thousands of tests every day. At one point, we were doing 3% of the tests that were being done in the United States were happening right here in Champaign-Urbana. It's a large cost to come with that. So we're going to see less monies to the library. We're going to see less monies to some of those other things, even if the revenue is the same, because it just can't spread. But in reality, I think we know that libraries for the last 10 years, 20 years, have really been needing to try and find the way that they articulate their value within the campus ecosystem. And of course, myself, going back to my ACRL presidency, value of academic libraries, this is not a new call that I would make here. But we are really going to have to articulate that value. And in particular, we are going to have to articulate that value without, at least for the moment, being able to rely on some factors that have really been in our favor. And the number one of which has been space. For undergraduate students, space has been a massive value that the library has brought to them. And we have essentially removed that from the campus equation for the moment, with some minimal exceptions. We also know that collections, as they go digital and become more accessible, our role actually becomes more invisible. So it's ultimately a good for our patrons, but it is therefore a burden on us to articulate what is the expense in creating that invisibility and that ease of access that people are getting used to. Now, the good news is they're also seeing maybe some of the behind the scenes in ways they never have before. So I think, just to kind of sum up, we have this moment of great opportunity, and my worry is that we are tired and it is very, very tempting to kind of fall back to past practices. And I will say, those of you may know, certainly we did some work with Hadi Trust, looking, my colleague Christine Wolf-Eisenberg at Ithaca and SNR, when we did the academic library and COVID survey in March. We just released our findings from September, in which we see that in particular with respect to remote work, academic libraries are quickly reverting to prior practices. And this is not what we see, for example, elsewhere in industry. And so perhaps there's good reasons for that. I'm just hoping it's not because, oh, we can just go back to what we are before, and that we actually take this opportunity to create a next version of the library that's better than the version we had before, and that is more responsive to what our patrons need from us at this time, but also going forward.
Okay, thank you. So Patricia, I'm wondering if you could talk about the opportunities and threats that you see.
So I think Lisa has covered very well the challenges with space right now. I hope that some of the for example, digital scholarship centers have been one of the most lauded areas of library spaces, right, in the last few years, and now many of them are underused, if not being used at all. So I have wondered, even though those spaces are not being used, what about the personnel that is accustomed to being in those spaces and accustomed to the technologies and the virtual environments that those spaces often require for digital projects? And I have wondered whether there could be more repurposing of roles. You know, my librarian colleagues could speak more to that. It sounds like that would still be a challenge. I hear you, Lisa, on the invisibility, the increasing invisibility of libraries and librarians as a result of the pandemic. And I worry that I have too many on the threat side and not enough on the opportunity side. But one threat that I've been thinking about, or one scenario that I've been thinking about, is closures of institutions, and the fact that, you know, because of the economic fragility that we're currently experiencing, and the fact that that will mean collection holding. What will that mean for collection holdings? What will that mean for staff who are responsible for, you know, the libraries? You know, how are libraries and archives even planning, you know, for something like that? Like that was, you don't learn about that in library school necessarily. You learn about disaster planning in the case of natural disasters, but how much do you learn about developing an exit plan for your library, for your staff, for your collections? So I do wonder about, you know, the readiness, you know, for that, because that often does not get to be a reality until the very last minute. Are there ways for the institution to be of benefit to the local community in all this? Often in a local community, there's a lot of reliance on the campus, or even to some extent, if it's a public institution, the library, because it is open to the public. So I have wondered, you know, are there ways, is this an opportunity actually to rethink interdependence because of what the institution brings to the local community, and how perhaps the local community could be of help in this closure. But also for well-resourced institutions that may never have to consider being closed, and there are some, right? I mean, I can think of some that will probably not face that future. How have they been guided or even mentored to think generously during a time like this for less resource institutions? Not sure that that's even, I mean, that may sound like crazy talk actually, but because this is not a time to take advantage of the weak, I think, but a time to leverage the capacity of those who are strong, so to speak. What would it mean so that generosity, empathy, and equity are the prevailing practices as we think about imminent closure and imminent loss of staff? So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Kathleen, you touched on some of the opportunities and threats actually in your opening remarks, but I'm wondering if you might double down on one or two of the things that you mentioned.
Absolutely, absolutely. A lot of what I have to say here is going to overlap with the things that Lisa and Patricia have raised, and Patricia's last comments there about what it would be to build more generous institutions, or, you know, music to my ears, as you might imagine. I mean, we are at a moment at which, and speaking from my role as a faculty member right now, we are being approached by our institutions almost daily, being asked to take part in what's being described to us as a shared sacrifice in order to keep the institution rolling. We all know, however, that sacrifice rolls downhill. And those who are least able to handle the sacrifice are being asked to give up most. So all of the fissures that have long existed in our systems of employment on campus, between tenured and tenure track faculty and contingent faculty, between faculty and staff, between full-time staff and student employees. I mean, like, all of this is coming to the surface now. And again, those who were already most precarious are now in a situation of increasing precarity. And the threat is, of course, that we lose a lot of colleagues, and that we end up with institutions that aren't sustainable because they're not properly staffed anymore. From, you know, the perspective of a scholar thinking about opportunities at this moment, the budgetary situation is bad enough on most campuses that it's hard to imagine where opportunities might lie. But I do think that we have a moment right now when we can think seriously about pedagogy, and about how we use distance education, remote instruction, in ways that sort of force it to come of age. We have had sort of half measures toward teaching online that have been in place for quite some time. Now we really have to contend with what it is our instruction is for and what the different modalities of instruction might actually be good for, and what kinds of new possibilities teaching online might present if we take it seriously as a form of teaching. So I think that's one opportunity that we're faced with if we are ready to take advantage of it. Coming back to my position with Humanities Commons, I think we face a tremendous opportunity as organizations and institutions are sort of forced to recognize, if you'll forgive the phrase, the value proposition behind a network like Humanities Commons, what it is good for and what we can do for higher education writ broadly. I think there's a real possibility that those organizations now having to cancel in-person meetings, having to meet remotely with committees can say, we have this platform where we could do all of this work. The danger for a platform like ours is precisely the thing that Lisa was describing, right? We're new. We don't seem to be right at the heart of the mission. And so it's very easy for institutions and organizations to look at an investment in a platform like ours as being non-necessary. Needless to say, I hope that doesn't happen. But I think that there is a real opportunity that I do hope organizations and institutions recognize, both for instruction and for research, that we can now look at these platforms in new ways and think about what those investments can do for us.
Thank you. So for those of you who have submitted questions, I promise I'll get to them, but we're going to get through the panel first, and we're going to leave at least 15 minutes for your questions, because this is a really rich discussion, but the question and answer session is actually the most important section. And so now I want to pivot to talk about systemic racism. We all know that this country is reckoning, or at least has talked about reckoning. And I think that from the very beginning of this meeting, the issue of racial equity and social justice, these have been themes and topics that have come up many times. And so to the panelists, and starting with you, Patricia, just talk about how, or what you think the possibilities are. And then I also want to know how optimistic you are about our abilities as philanthropic institutions, higher ed, are able to truly institute change, dismantle systems, and think about a more generous, compassionate, empathetic future.
Well, it's a loaded series of questions, but obviously highly relevant. So I think I'm going to go to the question about optimism first, if I can. I like to be optimistic, but I also know that we're talking about structures and systems that have persisted for centuries with very scant adoption of racial justice practices. So, you know, I mean, talk about culture eat strategy for breakfast. You could have, you know, a very deep, a careful strategy for DEI in your organization, but it all depends on whether there is readiness. A lot depends on whether there is readiness to change the culture, to adopt those practices. But I think there are a few optimistic signs. And one is, you know, as we've seen this past summer, organizations put out statements in support of Black Lives Matter, again, as they did years before when there were previous uprisings. But now I think Black and brown people in those organizations are holding their leadership accountable for actually implementing those statements, for making them actionable, and for really committing to what those statements say and what those principles are. So that's really heartening to see, that there is that much momentum for keeping people, places accountable. But let's also hope that the leadership of these organizations really do follow through and view these occasions as opportunities to listen, to evaluate their current practices, to show care, to give agency, and to ensure empowerment, and to start new collaborations. What I worry about is that because of this intense time, organizations will see the commitment, will do do this, but we'll see it as a special project and not something to, really make or ensure that the organization, that there is adoption organization-wide. I do think increasingly there is a readiness to change practices in favor of DEI. And you were talking about, I think it was Lisa talking about core values. It's a core value and it should be reinforced, and organizational practices should reflect that value. I think I also want to say something else that I'm optimistic about, and that is this moment could be a boon to ethnic studies. But I also hope that the investment that institutions seem to be starting to make in this area are not short-lived, and it's not just a trend. Domain knowledge in this area has always been important, but it seems even more so if we're going to change our culture to be racially just. Investing and reinvesting in ethnic studies subject areas are very likely to have positive effects and outcomes for technology, for tools, for platforms that support research and scholarship in these areas. And it will likely mean that different things get collected, archived, preserved, published, shared, and used. And finally, I think it's past time that our organizations commit to the retention, not just pipeline initiatives, but the retention of BIPOC professionals. We have any number of pipeline programs, and my own organization has funded those programs. Lots of opportunities for getting into the door of the profession. Where are the opportunities to help ensure that BIPOC professionals also stay, that librarians who are from underrepresented groups, archivists from underrepresented groups find, community in their organizations and want to stay in them. So that's a real worry that I have, that we're not paying as much attention to that. And that's a reflection of an organization not really reinforcing that core value of DEI. So I think I'll stop there, although I have a feeling I don't know if I gave many possibilities, but I think I'll lean on my colleagues to share some of those possibilities.
No, I think you touched on a lot of the key things that a lot of us are thinking of. So thank you. Kathleen, I'm wondering if you could shed some light on the possibilities and optimism of this moment we're in and the movement for Black Lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to echo everything that Patricia said. I think that question of the turn from organizational projects with respect to DEI to an organizational culture that's really about social justice is absolutely the shift that we need. Am I optimistic about our ability to make that shift? I am an optimist at heart, and some of my optimism just comes from thick-headedness, frankly, my determination that, we've got to do something, so let's do it. We must make these institutions better, more just, more equitable places to work. Am I optimistic about the path to get to where I would like us to be? I would like to hold that answer in reserve until after November 3rd. I think that we have a real crucial couple of weeks ahead of us in thinking about what's going to be possible. We're hearing stories out there. As Patricia says, this is a really crucial moment for ethnic studies, but we're also hearing stories out there about institutions that are getting nervous about their ethnic studies programs in the light of administration statements about wanting to undermine those programs. So I am hopeful that in a couple of weeks, I'll be feeling more optimistic about our ability to really put those programs forward as to invest in those programs in the ways that we should have been investing in them all along. right? And to really think about social justice as a core component to higher education, to really listen to not just faculty and staff of color on our campuses, but our students who are coming from communities of color, who are coming from who are members of the first generation in their families to go to college, that we might have the opportunity to engage with them and figure out with them what a higher education should be in the 21st century, what the social good that higher education can provide might look like moving forward. So I think we have a great deal of opportunity in front of us. And I hope that we will have even more opportunity, but it's going to take real determination on all our parts to ensure that we don't simply say, well, we changed some policies and we've got some new documents and we hired a couple of people and so everything is fine. The change has to be at the cultural level, as Patricia suggested. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So I think one of the things we're noticing is, I'm old enough to remember when the value of diversity was that it brings innovation, people work together, better organizations. And I think we're pivoting to a point to say it's the right thing to do. This country was founded on violence, and oppression, and it continues. It was sustained by violence and oppression, and this continues today. So, Lisa, Kathleen and Patricia have already said a lot, but what else do you have to add to this?
So, I will say that I have an immense amount of confidence in our ability to carry this work off if we choose to. I will be reserved about our willingness to do so, because I think that it is very easy for us to talk about the values of diversity and inclusion and fail to do a power analysis, which is to remember that creating these diverse, inclusive, and equitable environments will disempower people who currently have power, and they will not go willingly. And so I don't mean to be a wet blanket, but I do mean to be a realist. And I will admit that when you take the Bowman Deal leadership frames, like on the power relations lens, I'm like way off the chart. So it is my proclivity to look at the world in this way. But I will also share with you why I still believe that we can and eventually will make this. And this really, for me, comes from the people that I see who are going in through the MLS program in the iSchool at Illinois. They are ready, willing, pushing, dissatisfied, not even satisfied with the curriculum that they're being developed, and pushing everyone who is teaching them or mentoring them to be better. But what I want to say is, I think Patricia's point about pipeline is exactly the point. People have been coming into the field, pushing on these things, and the field has pushed back and pushed them away. And so for those of us in leadership positions, our responsibility, especially if we are not people of color, is to use our elbows to create space at the table. Because, as I said, ultimately, this is just for me, it's going to come down to a power analysis. People with power will have to be the ones to step back and to not fight this. And I am hopeful. I am in awe of the iSchool students, and I feel personally that I need to say Monica Ho, who was my grad assistant last year, who we've actually sent into your area of the world, Elaine, working at Novelist, and Nancy Kirkpatrick, who some of you will know from her work in Ohio and Michigan, two people that I worked with very closely when they were in the iSchool, and they continue to educate me. So I would also just encourage us to turn our attention away from ourselves and what we might think directly, and to those who we might learn from, whether they are students, current professionals, or those who may have retired from the field.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say that what I heard from all of you is kind of goes back to that phrase that hope is a discipline, and that despair is a privilege and a luxury. Right? So we have no choice but to hope. I know my ancestors, we're hopeful, and I'm here because of that. So, so I had a really awesome question that I was going to ask about resilience and wellness, but we're at 3:15, and I see a bunch of questions coming through. So I'm going to go to the questions, and then if we have some time, we could squeeze in a little bit about my question about wellness and resilience. So the first question I have is that someone says, well, libraries can't actually change the academic landscape on our own, right? Libraries and librarians and even library administrators. And this is for all of the panelists. Do you get the impression that higher ed leadership, such as presidents, boards, provosts, are they ready to start mobilizing against the corporate business model for higher ed that they have been forced to adopt and embrace over the past decades? Easy, boy, I gave you a really hard question to start off with. Thanks, Jennifer, for that question. So who wants to tackle that question first?
I can start very briefly, though. I hope Lisa and Patricia will join in because I have a very narrow perspective on this. I do think, based on a lot of the response that I've received, a lot of the lecture invitations and the emails and the questions that I've gotten about generous thinking, that there are quite a number of provosts and presidents out there who recognize that they really need a culture change on their campuses, who understand that thinking about the relationship between the institution and the public good is necessary and increasingly necessary to the survival of the institution. Whether that means that they're really ready to undo the privatization that's happened on campuses, that incorporation of the corporate mindset that is described in this question, is a whole other issue. And in part, that has to do, for a lot of them, with their boards of trustees and where the members of those boards come from, why they have become members of those boards, whether they're politically appointed or they're politically elected. Those are often highly successful businessmen and women, pardon me, who come to those positions with a particular mindset and bring to the governance of the institution this sense that it should be more businesslike and efficient. And really undoing that mindset at the board level is going to require significant work on the part of the faculty and the students and the staff and the entire institution to work with the community that it serves to demonstrate to the board what it is that higher education is genuinely for. It's a long road, I think, but I do think that there are some institutions and some administrations at those institutions that are ready to start taking that step. So with a lot of organizing and a lot of persistence, I think we might be able to move in that direction.
Thank you. Looks like Patricia, you're teed up.
Yeah, sure. I'll just chime in just briefly. I'm glad you mentioned boards and governance, Kathleen, because I think we are also increasingly mindful of board composition and leadership history, and whether they reflect the values, the kinds of values that we are wanting to support. So I realize that that may, I don't know if it really answers what I'm saying, really answers what Jennifer is getting at in terms of trying to start mobilizing. But if funders are starting to look closely at, governance and board composition, that could be a signal that, there needs to be some change happening. And I'm not saying explicitly that, we as a foundation have made this explicit step, but it is certainly something that we are looking at, from consultants to vendors to advisory boards. What does the advisory board of a grant project, which has, less relationship to this question, but just the fact that we are examining composition and where, members come from, I think that could translate to the composition of a board of trustees at a higher education institution too.
I feel like it's going to be my job now to be like, and so for almost all of us, we have all been hired to carry out the capitalistic agenda of higher education. That's actually probably somewhere either directly or indirectly in our job description. And I think we can see it in, just things like our library policies around, I mentioned before how we're seeing what is core, right? So how many libraries have protected protected and maybe even expanded the OER and open access budgets and cut their subscription budgets? Now, I'm not saying no one has, but by and large, that is not the trend. So one of the things I think we have to always ask ourselves is, are we looking for someone else in the system to change the system, and not as willing to look at the ways that we ourselves are carrying out that system? And I think it's, very easy to point at our administrators, and the administrators will point at someone else. And, especially those of us who are full-time, I would call on us to think about our relationship to our part-time peers, those of us tenured, the untenured peers, think about the way graduate and undergraduate employees are treated even in our own organizations. We are all carrying out this inequitable system. And so, which is not to say we shouldn't demand that it change, but I think we really have to organize ourselves for what those demands would look like, and probably begin to make them of ourselves as part of making them of other people as well.
Okay. Well, I have to say, even going back to the last question about optimism, I mean, I do have some optimism because of the newer librarians that are coming through. I mean, I think many of them, they just want to blow stuff up, and I don't know if blowing it up is going to get us to freedom, but it's that younger, or not necessarily younger, but the new group of students that are coming down the pike that I think are really inspirational. So another question that's come through is about core. What is core for libraries? What's core for higher ed? How do we define what is most important for us to in terms of services, in terms of how we partner? That is a question I know in my own organization, when it came down to thinking about what we would do when the library reopened, we couldn't do everything. So you had to pick the most important things that you needed to do. And I have to tell you, it wasn't a question that I think a lot of people think about, but we certainly think about it now. And you think about it when it comes time to budgets. So I'll start with you, Lisa, because I think you were the one that really started that conversation, going down that path of how do you know what's core and how do you know what's valuable?
Right. So, I mean, I think I just gave away a couple of my examples there, right? With the, what are we funding? What have we chosen to fund? I also think that the reality is we have to do this in a context of where other people understand their understanding of what is core. I'm talking with many library directors. They have had very strong direction from their campus about what is core and what must be brought back first. And that has, in many cases, not necessarily been what the library itself would choose. And so I think that is one of the questions, the degree to which the library is carrying out an organizational imperative, that carrying out a university or college imperatives, is the library able to influence and impact the overall mission and the like. But I mean, one thing I'm looking forward to, no doubt some people on this call have filled out this survey. Ithaca put out their library director survey out of cycle. It's very exciting because there was one last year, and so now we'll get one this year. And so I'm very interested to see if there's been any change in the six purposes of a library that they have in that survey, and the way library directors are perceiving their purpose on campus. And where will we see those dials change? I don't know. I'm definitely very curious, though, to see the collective view of that, because it seems to me that we're very, very, very focused on bringing back our access to our collections and spaces for probably some good reason. But maybe other things have gone by the wayside as extra, or we can't get to that project right now. And I think strategically, there's some questions there too of what that will do to the library's ability to be seen as core innovative capacity on a given campus.
Anyone else want to weigh in on who gets to decide what's core? I mean, Lisa, you touched on it, but that's also part of it is the campus thinks, like you said, the campus thinks certain things are core, and then the library might think that other things are core. And that dissonance creates definitely challenges. So I'm going to move on to another question. And I think Kathleen, you kicked us off with this discussion about the privatization of higher ed, and there's a lot of comments about that. And now this takes us back to a question about tenure. And I wanted you to talk about the challenges around it, the fact that universities are increasingly reducing the size of the tenured faculty, and a lot of the instruction is falling on the backs of graduate students and faculty who are not tenure tracked and who are less enfranchised. So talk about tenure and how you're thinking about that.
I mean, this is sort of the $64,000 question always, right? Is tenure and its role in frankly having deformed a whole lot of the systems through which we work on our campuses, having deformed our processes of scholarly communication as they become just steps along the way toward tenure. And having certainly deformed the relationships among instructors of a wide variety of appointment types as understanding themselves as engaged in the same form of labor. I believe that there is a continuing importance to tenure, but I think we need collectively to step back from that specific form that it takes today and the specific processes through which one earns it and the specific privileges that it confers, to instead think about what the purposes of tenure are and how we can work to ensure that those purposes, those protections that tenure provides are extended to everyone on campus who is engaged in that same form of work. If the purpose of tenure, if the protection of tenure is a conferral of a kind of academic freedom and a conferral of an ability to work without fear on the kind of work that you want to do, this should be the core value of our institutions and should be extended to everyone on campus. It's only at that point when we recognize that all of our colleagues on campus should be entitled to that same level of protection, that we're then able to look at one another across our various appointment types and say, you know what, we really actually are all in it together, and build some kind of solidarity that we simply do not have right now. Right now, the purpose of tenure is to find yourself in a position where you can say no to particular kinds of work that you don't want to do, so that those forms of work now roll off onto somebody else. And that's just wrong, right? I don't think I need to say much more about that than that. But you know, to have that kind of conversation about what the purpose of tenure is really super risky, in no small part because the incursions that we're seeing into tenure are not coming as a means of attempting to build more solidarity across the various forms of labor on campus. They're coming as a means of transforming the entirety of the campus into the precariat, right? It's a means of ensuring that anyone can be fired at will. And that is clearly not the end that we want to support. right? So thinking about tenure and the damage that it's done, but also thinking about tenure and the good that it has been meant to serve and how to extend that good, I think is a really crucial set of conversations that, as I say, are not going to be easy to have, because those of us with tenure like to protect our privilege, but that are really increasingly necessary for the survival of our institutions.
Thank you. So I'm sad to say that we have reached the end of this panel. I'm seeing a lot of good vibes, shout outs, fists, that are with us and appreciate it. So Patricia, thank you, Lisa and Kathleen. This has been an amazing conversation. I wish we could do this for another 2 hours, but we can't. So I want to thank you. And I don't know if I turn it back over to Mike or Jessica, or how do we close this out?
I think we should say thank you as well to you, Elaine, for your really
Yes.
thoughtful framing of the questions. Thank you.
Yes.
Indeed,
Thank you so
thank you.
much. Yeah.